Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 30th of November 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is Alex Thomson from Eastern Approaches. No Brian today. Brian's off sick at the moment. And I'd just like to apologise for there being no news yesterday. We had a combination of Brian being off and a technical problem, just wasn't possible. So apologies for that. But we're back. And Alex, welcome to the programme. How's things in the Netherlands?
Well, it's quite sunny here for a change, but it's been a few degrees below zero actually the last couple of days, and just warm during the daytime. People are looking fairly concerned, I have to say. The Dutch are usually quite carefree; they walk around with a happy whistle, but they're looking a wee bit sombre at the moment.
So cold on the continent, but things heating up with regard to whether countries are going to leave the European Union or not. This was the Independent, the countries most likely to follow Britain and leave the EU next. And really, you're wanting to highlight Germany in particular, and the fact that, well, basically, at least the opinion polls are suggesting that nobody wants to leave the EU in Germany. But do we trust opinion polls anymore?
Well, perhaps not these because they're from YouGov, and YouGov has some interesting membership behind it. If I'm not mistaken, it's owned by Peter Kellner, the husband of Lady Catherine Ashton, the former High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs of the European Union. But there's definitely, even if there's been some massaging there, there's a grain of truth in this, that the Germans are, as you see on that slide, half as keen as any other country on recovering their independence. Well, that's what you get with 3 generations of them being told at school, the EU is our nation now, Germany bad, Germany bad. This is really the key to explaining why Merkel is being very strict with the UK and taking over the reins of negotiation from the European institutions with the UK on the terms of supposed Brexit, because her people have got nowhere else to go as far as she's concerned. They must absolutely stay in the EU, or they'll recover some awful German national sentiment.
Okay, well, let's move on then to Jean-Claude Juncker, one of the European presidents, because of course Europe, being as it is, needs more than one president. And this headline here from Euronews is entitled, "Marine Le Pen will not be France's next president," says Juncker. But you wanted me to quote a couple of things out of this. This is by a journalist called Isabel Kumar. And she says, "But we have the impression that the European Union is looking more and more like a house of cards. Austria is holding a presidential election in a few days' time that could put a far right leadership in place for the first time since the Second World War. There is talk of plans for a referendum then being held on EU membership. Things are getting worrying, aren't they?" And that's the question to Juncker. And Juncker said, "We can't deny or take away the people of Europe's right to express their views. Regarding referenda on EU membership, I think it's not wise to organise this kind of debate. Not only because I might be concerned about the final result, but because this will pile more controversy onto the huge number already present at the heart of the EU. Besides, I don't think the next president of Austria, whoever it will be, will launch themselves into this kind of escapade." Alex, is this what referenda in the EU is all about then? Escapades?
It's astonishing language, isn't it, Mike? And I mean, he's given a number of. You must read the article, by the way. It's got his frank views on everything, and in his usual marionette style of, I don't dare oppose me. So he's speaking about Britain, about the possibility of other countries leaving. And he's confronted with, as you say, there just what happens if Mr. Norbert Hofer is elected to the figurehead role of Austrian president, who doesn't really have political power. And I covered the fact that he was nearly elected, very, very close runoff, in fact, earlier this year, and they're doing the postponed rerun now against the Green candidate Alexander von der Bellen. But he says, whether it's von der Bellen or Hofer, they will not arrange such an escapade. This is a naked threat. And by the way, he threatens the female journalist later in the article when she says that Günther Oettinger, the German EU commissioner, called the Chinese slitty eyes and got caught out doing it, much like our own dear Prince Philip some years ago. He says, "Don't you dare be like that with me, young lady." You really must read the text.
Right, and so let's move on with it then, because what she goes on to say is, the question is, can the EU survive if Marine Le Pen becomes president? And he says it's a question that we should not even be asking. Well, why not?
because he knows that Marine Le Pen is not going to be French president, is my guess. And how he knows that, I don't know.
Okay. And then she asks she says that a German viewer would like to know if the UK should be used as an example to discourage other countries who might be thinking of leaving. And he said, it's not really a question of that. I'm not looking for revenge when it comes to the UK. The British have had their say by universal suffrage. I hope others do not do the same. But regarding the UK, we must not come to this in the spirit of revenge. We must sort out the problems this has caused for the UK and for Europeans. We will make sure relations between the British Isles and the continent remain harmonious, all the while knowing that the British cannot have the same rights and advantages as citizens of the European Union. I don't think we want them, do we?
No, we don't. I mean, he's talking as though he holds all the cards, but as we just mentioned, it's Merkel who's really negotiating for the rump EU, not him. And that has rather annoyed him. Romano Prodi, the former European commissioner, so that he had the role that Juncker now has been in the press lamenting the fact that the European Commission no longer calls the shots because these pesky member states, the powerful ones like Germany, now insist on actually having a say in the running of the EU. So the power is slipping away. And as one of our viewers has said in the chat room, Juncker is afraid. He certainly is.
Okay, well, we haven't done a book spot for quite some time. So just let's talk about the Commission for a second. So you want to highlight this book, The Life of a European Mandarin, Inside the Commission. What's the point of this? What are the point are they making here?
Well, it's written by a very frank Dutchman called Dirk Jan Epping, who worked for a very frank liberal market type commissioner, Frits Bolkestein. You might remember from the Bolkestein Directive, which basically threatened to have us employed in Britain by a British company under Romanian legislation because two member states were member states, right? And that was fortunately defeated. But this Epping is very frank about his own failings, and he tells us how he leaked everything to the Financial Times because that's what Mandarins do to get their way before votes, how the civil servants control the commissioners, how the commissioners have no say because the president of the commission, and more particularly the civil servants in the president's outfit, have pre-cooked everything. All very familiar stuff to me. It's a brilliant read. The translation is pretty funny as well, and I recommend you pore through this book, which is quite thick, as you see, because it has some real reminiscences. It was written about 2005, at the end of that kind of high watermark period when the EU really thought it was going to replace the nation state. Of course, we've had a decade of it collapsing since then, bit by bit, and that's coming out now with Juncker expressing it openly. But this captures the snapshot of how the EU was at its mightiest. One of the gobsmacking things in there is that he records that on the 6th of September 2001, 3 days before 9/11, they had a directive all done and dusted for completely deregulated open borders immigration to the whole EU. And this went through without a whimper from any civil servants, and the commissioners just ticked it through, and it only got stopped by 9/11.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Prodi and his complaints in the press that the Commission is losing its power. Is he maybe exaggerating just a little bit here?
Yes, he's lamenting the end of an era. He's 77. As you know, Gerard Batten, MEP, one of the UKIP MEPs, has outed him as a communist who was protecting KGB informers in the European Union. And what he's particularly lamenting, and you see this in the European Union, you really do, he's not just making it up, is that the meeting of the Council, right? The European body has these three bodies, the Council, the Commission and the Parliament, and people forget about the Council. When the Council meets, that's the heads of government, often having an acrimonious all-nighter. And they actually have theoretically as much say in some things as the Commission, but for years they let their mandarins run everything through the Commission. Now they're no longer happy to do so. The French, the Italians, the Germans all come and bang their fist on the table in the way Mrs. Thatcher used to do with her handbag. So the Council is actually taking back the lead, and that's a fairly inevitable process and irreversible now. The EU will never be a superstate because the nation states are actually reasserting their will, not just Britain.
Well, of course, there is a referendum going on at the moment in Italy, much to Juncker's disgust, on whether they stay within the euro or not. Well, this is an Italian press article commenting on a Financial Times press article, which, Alex, I mean, it certainly comes across as a threat. Basically, what the financial this headline is calling what the Financial Times wrote an act of financial terrorism. The Financial Times basically saying up to 8 of Italy's troubled banks risk failing if Prime Minister Renzi loses a constitutional referendum next weekend, and ensuing market turbulence deters investors from recapitalizing them. So this is the FT article: fears mount of multiple bank failures if Renzi loses referendum. But the text of it is really comes across as a bit of a threat. You vote the right way, or else the markets are going to pull the rug out from under these 8 banks. Did you read it the same way?
Yes, I did, and we have to realise what the FT is. That book I just mentioned by Dirk Jan Epping says from cover to cover, if we wanted to bat away a suggestion or get our legislation through before anyone democratically chosen had ever seen it, we leaked to the Financial Times because that was our sledgehammer. Everyone who was worth their salt read the FT and knew that it was the mouthpiece of the European project. What he doesn't quite specify, because he's a Dutch Anglophile, and so was his boss, is that the whole European project ultimately is being steered by the Anglo-Americans. I don't think he's quite awake to that, and he really thought it was naively thought it was something being pushed by the continental countries. But be that as it may, the FT is there to say on behalf of the city and Wall Street, look, if you don't toe the line, we're going to reduce your liquidity. And Prodi himself, of course, went into politics really as a Goldman Sachs type man, and we've had this since with other people just parachuted into the Italian and Greek prime ministership. So you can see what the threat is. If we don't have our man at the helm, we won't give you any more credit, and allegedly all the banks will collapse. But the Italians have seen through all this now.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's move on to British banking, because the Bank of England has been busy in the last couple of days, and they've published a couple of reports. The first is the stress tests of British banks, and Royal Bank of Scotland has come out at the bottom of the pile. No surprises there. Still 73% owned by the taxpayer, and they have fallen short of these stress tests. Their deputy bank governor said it's taking a long time to move this bank forward. If you've got incompetent management, that's probably the case. But as well as that, of course, they are the most bankrupt of the British banks at the moment as well. But something that I found particularly interesting was that when they ran the stress tests on RBS, when they were running the stress tests on all the British banks, it was based on a scenario where there would be, it was a 5-year scenario, £44 billion of capital wiped out in the first 2 years, which is 5 times what happened in 2008. But under the scenario, the banks would be setting aside £48 billion of costs, which would be incurred to pay fines and legal costs. So in other words, Alex, this absolutely staggers me, because what they're saying, what the Bank of England is saying, is we're going to run a stress test on the banks. We're going to see whether that stress test identifies any problems. But one of the problems that we have to test against is the fact that the banks are so corrupt that they're going to incur all kinds of legal costs and compensation costs should there be another financial crash. And that's got to be a pretty spectacular acknowledgement by the financial system and the City of London.
It is, Mike, and I wonder how much tie across there is to Zurich Insurance, the preferred insurer of local authorities, at least in England and Wales, which has made it quite clear that it has factored in a massive risk of councils being sued for permitting and even encouraging, in some cases, child abuse in their institutions and among the foster parents working for those councils. So I think the actuaries are very smart. I mean, you don't get into that profession without being very clever. And I think they well realise that there's things coming down the pipeline as well. Here on the continent, the stress tests, when they were introduced a couple of years ago, threw up the fact that there was a problem, so-called, with German and other Germanic countries' banks because they were too small and local and solvent. So inevitably they failed, ironically, they failed that stress test because they didn't have huge amounts of capital sloshing around. Well, they didn't need it because they didn't lend more than they had. And the so-called solution the Continentals had was to get these hundreds of banks merged into a few super banks closely regulated. Again, it's the Anglo-Saxon run out of control corporate model that seems to be pushing things on the continent.
Absolutely. Now, the other thing that the Bank of England has published today is the financial stability report for 2016, and they're saying that the financial system is facing a challenging outlook. They're saying that following the US election, there have been significant changes in global asset prices. They're saying the rise in advanced economy sovereign yields, coupled with the risk of reduced global trade, has reinforced the vulnerabilities associated with those emerging market economies with high levels of debt. And so they go on. But certainly one of the themes of this report is that the reason for any instability in the financial system is Brexit, and really the sort of the political movement that's growing up around the world of the same type. So Mark Carnage, as we've said, the financial system remains challenging, risks remain elevated. But one of the things that he was highlighting in this report and in his briefing this morning was the levels of household debt in the UK. And he said that people are drawing down on savings for the first time since 2008, since before 2008, that they're borrowing more. But he said, don't worry about that because the banks are in a great place to service this need. I'm not quite sure how that gels with the stress test report, but anyway, he says they're in a great place. So 190 billion pounds is now owed on credit cards. Well, let's just remind ourselves of what the overall debt situation is in the UK at the moment. And as we can remind ourselves, household debt at the moment in total, including mortgages and so on, is £1.5 trillion or so. So he's now complaining that 190 billion of that is owed on credit cards, loans and overdrafts, that's 11% more than it was 12 months ago. And he's saying that this is the largest increase since 2005. So that puts an average debt on British households, excluding mortgages, of £7,300. But as I say, the banks are in a great place to service the future need of more debt. So we're going to print money via credit agreements. We're going to put people in a position where they're failing personal stress tests, never mind the bank stress tests. And then, Alex, we're going to asset strip everybody. That seems to be the they've hollowed out these banks. They've effectively deliberately made them bankrupt. They're effectively insolvent. So there could be no other outcome other than to start calling in debts the way RBS has done in the past, and that of course will result in property being taken from people.
Property, absolutely. And if you look at how this happened in ancient history as well, if people are obliged to pawn or mortgage their houses to sell their debts and that doesn't work, the next thing that happens, described in many ancient texts, is that the creditors, often foreign gentlemen even in those days, came along and took your children to work as slaves. So I think that kind of indicates what's going on with these national service projects.
Yes. Okay, well, let's move on to Europe now. This is sort of constitutional issues, and this is a Telegraph here. The headline is Dutch MPs vote to ban the burqa in public places. When your comment to me was this goes beyond burqa.
It does. It's you can't have a balaclava on if it's cold. There's requirements, not just religious, but traditional, customary for all kinds of people to have face coverings. Now, the Dutch have claimed that they have excluded cultural wearing or cultural festivals, I think is the wording of the Dutch bill. But in the Dutch system, that's never going to be challenged by a jury because they don't have them. It's going to be interpreted by jurisprudence, legislating from the bench. And of course, they're all dead against burqas and niqabs because they believe in this one-dimensional idea of stopping the oppression of women. And it's interesting that we've had this bogus climate of terrorists lurking around every corner, which gets the middle classes thinking, well, unfortunately, we just have to give up these liberties now because we're not safe. And once you've put that in people's minds, it's almost welcomed rather than derided that you tell people what they need to wear in public.
And where does this leave people that perhaps want to wear masks at a demonstration or cover their faces in some way at a demonstration?
Well, absolutely. That's not a cultural festival. I mean, the kind of thing they're thinking of excluding is down in Brabant, in the south of the country here. They have these carnivals in February, and then they put on these colourful masks and, frightening ones and dance around. And that's probably the kind of thing that will be excluded because it's traditional. But you see that, and anyone else who wants to cover their face for a host of legitimate reasons, some medical, is going to be tackled by policemen. And this is spread through all the most statist countries now, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And Germany, I think, maybe next. And Britain is talking about it, though how you can square that with common law, I don't know.
Well, indeed, that's a good question. And speaking of common law, this is another Telegraph article: enshrine new conscience clause for Christians in Bill of Rights. So we're absolutely pushing for this new Bill of Rights, which of course completely undermines and infringes our current Bill of Rights, which is a common law contract, as it were.
Yeah.
But give us the background to this.
Well, the couple you see there are the Ashers, the bakery couple from Northern Ireland. I think only overseas viewers would perhaps not be aware of them, and even there, this case has received big coverage. They were asked by a customer who didn't even say he was homosexual, so they were not discriminating against him on that basis, and they'd served him before. He said, "I want a cake with support gay marriage on it," and they said, "We can't put that message on the cake." This was taken to the Northern Ireland equality and human rights people as if it were discrimination against him rather than against the message, and this was upheld even on appeal. And because Harriet Harman's Equality Act 2010, which has been called socialism in one clause, puts an absolute duty on all public bodies to uphold these principles, and we've had it subsequently confirmed by the Supreme Court that they regard that as constitutional legislation on a par with Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights, that 2010 Equality Act. Therefore, that's regarded as a settled thing that we can't touch in our constitution, although it's only a statute. And now, having to come to terms with this, we're having to pile legislation upon legislation. So, again, as with the Dutch burqa situation, a false dichotomy, people unaware of their constitutional parameters and their history, unaware of how they've been exploited and tyrannized in the past. They're easy prey for this kind of thing. Wherever you see the word enshrine, you know that something dodgy is going on. Because enshrine is, as you would put it, Mike, and have done before, is a government saying we are giving you some rights, which in our munificence we might take away again. If you only enshrine things if they're not God-given in the first place.
Absolutely. Now, of course, something that happened yesterday, I think it was yesterday, was royal assent was given to the Investigatory Powers Bill. And as Ian Crane mentioned on Humanity versus Insanity on Monday night, this makes Britain the most surveilled country in the world, I think, and really puts Stasi Germany and Stalinist Russia to shame, Alex. And well, let's just put this up, because the campaign, the petition to repeal the new surveillance laws is now at 144,791. That was this morning, a couple of hours ago. I think everybody should be signing this, really, but if it critically is over the 100,000 signature threshold that requires the government to consider this for debate in Parliament. It's pretty clear that they are pretty excited about these laws. They're calling it a landmark bill, which sets out and governs the powers available to the police, security, and intelligence agencies to gather and access electronic communications. And it has received royal assent. They're saying it will ensure that law enforcement and the security and intelligence agencies have the powers they need in a digital age to disrupt terrorist attacks, subject to strict safeguards and world-leading oversight. Well, that should make us all feel very good. The new legislation brings together and updates existing powers while radically overhauling how they're authorized and overseen. And they go on to say that it protects both privacy and security of the public by introducing a range of things that I'm not going to go through at the moment. Amber Rudd had this to say. She's the Home Secretary. She said, "This government is clear that at a time of heightened security threat, it is essential our law enforcement, security, and intelligence services have the powers they need to keep people safe." So that's really good, isn't it? And, I think we've made this point before, Alex, that this legislation, as draconian as it is, probably doesn't provide anything that hasn't been already taking place. So in other words, the security services, GCHQ and MI5, MI6, and Special Branch, in fact, have been doing things which were probably illegal over the last few years, and just not worrying too much about the law. This pretty much normalizes the situation, perhaps. But of course, you can't change the fact that the law was broken in the past, and you can apply legislation retrospectively. But nonetheless, this is a pretty serious development.
It is, Mike, and the thinking which you've outlined there is you enumerated the options of what to do when you've discovered that law has routinely been broken in the past. And of course, the one you didn't mention, because it's a kind of God forbid option for the government, is actually prosecute those who broke the law in the past. I mean, in the very same years, the first decade of this millennium, when I was a GCHQ officer, we got no end of communication saying we always follow legalities. They never mentioned the law, much less lawfulness, but they talked about legalities. And this fictional entity called UK law, which doesn't exist, but anyway, We always follow that, was the missive that was sent around certainly regarding warranting and targeting all the time, but certainly on courses as well. And at that very same time, we were being told you can process bulk data of British citizens and British residents. And even our allies at NSA, when I talked to them about that, they said, I can't believe you guys can do that. Congress has told us we can't do that in the US. And of course, Congress was quite right, because it's not what a foreign intelligence agency is there for. So it's all, again, just a bit like the Dutch and the human rights situations we discussed in the previous couple of slides. Again, we have a situation which has been tampered with by bad law. Heaven forfend that we should actually tackle the bad law and those who framed it. No, we have to build on top of the bad building that we already have. You mentioned the Snoopers Charter and the list of people who can, intelligence agencies, as they were euphemistically called there, who can read your entire browsing history. Well, one that I spotted in this list, who's now empowered to look at your whole browsing history, is the NHS Business Services Authority. What do they want to know about our history for?
Well, that's a very good question. There's a few others in there in that list that you could ask the same question, and of course this is really the main concern that people have, isn't it? That what they've done is opened a Pandora's box, and all and sundry seem to think that they've got the right to people's personal data and personal browsing habits.
That is the absolute key to it, Mike. Even if I do say it myself, we in the three proper agencies went through real training. We had history, decades long of it. We'd not quite fought the wars, but certainly the Cold War and the predecessors of our organizations had certainly been involved in the wars, in some cases even the First World War. And we knew what we were about and what we signed up for. And we regarded ourselves as bound by the same oaths, although we didn't take anything more than the Official Secrets Act. We thought ourselves bound by the same level of oaths to the Crown as military officers, alongside whom we served very closely. But if you're talking about local authorities and the Food Standards Authority and the NHS Businesses Authority and local councils, although local councils are not on this list, but they do have RIPA powers under the old system, they're obviously going to be very different in their approach. They're going to use these powers maximally rather than minimally as we did, and they're going to be, or to use the old phrase, rather jumped up self-important people about it.
Well, this article from depressa.com, we've got captioned that German spies to work beyond authority. How far behind us is Germany, actually?
I would say they're catching up quick, because they are regarding themselves as not even on the same rank as the other European continental countries in intelligence terms. They regard themselves, and we regard them, have done for some years now, as kind of almost up there with the Anglo-Saxons in the Five Eyes arrangement. The jargon used now is second or two and a half party, which is a bit of a shorthand, because second parties are those who are party to the UK-USA agreement not to spy on each other and to share everything. Third parties are all other countries' intelligence services, and the French and Germans recently were starting to be called two and a half parties because they were almost at the table with us. So we were almost sharing techniques with them and raw information almost in some cases. So they're powerful already. But this speech by Merkel at the 60th anniversary of the Foreign Intelligence Agency, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, at the podium she's at there, this is just after she announced that the Bundestag had approved a huge budget and remit increase for the spies. She is saying to these spies, who were only very recently moved from Dachau to Berlin to be at the center of power, she's saying, well, okay, you chaps now have to work much more closely together with Germany's equivalent of MI5, the domestic people, the BFV, the Constitutional Protection Agency is its official name. And if you don't, then this money will not be well spent. So she's really ordering them to turn into a single blob with far more powers and far less differentiation between what we spy on foreigners for and what we spy on our own people for.
And already the Telegraph here pointing out that one German intelligence officer has been arrested. What's this about?
Yes, it'll presumably be a Turkish immigrant, of whom there are many working for the BFV, the German Domestic Intelligence Agency. But anyway, this chap in Cologne, the very evening that Merkel said you, BND, are going to work much more closely with them, he was arrested, or the news broke that he'd been arrested because he was apparently plotting to blow up the headquarters of the BFV. So make of that what you will, either a fake news story, to use a word of the month, or it may be that there really has been infiltration, but it doesn't bode well.
Okay, and well, this article in Zeit Online suggesting that Merkel has imported terrorists
Yes, this is the candidate who got something like 49.9% or so in the first attempt to elect a new Austrian president earlier this year. If you watched the news at the time, I was showing how the whole country voted for him, and only certain districts of Vienna voted for the Green candidate, but they have the weight of population in Vienna. But anyway, he's having another go because a court has ordered a rerun. And in his head-to-head debate with Mr. von der Bellen, he was saying, we can't go on with more of the same because we Austrians were used as a corridor, as a funnel to import millions of people to Germany who had no documents, and some of them turned out to be terrorists. So he's actually saying, Germany and Austria, of course, have been extremely close partners, although Austria has strict neutrality and didn't even join the EU till '95 because of that neutrality, and has certainly never joined NATO. He's now saying, well, sorry, the game's up. We can't have the post-Second World War order, and we can't go on pretending the Germans are our best buddies or big brother, because they've really left us in the lurch now. They've imported terrorists for their own purposes.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to Syria then, and we'll look at Aleppo. Now, what I want to do here, I'm not going to even go into the detail of these articles, but I just wanted to contrast the news reporting on Aleppo with the news reporting on Mosul. And we have two very similar situations here, two cities which are held by terrorists, and which the government of the nations that they're in, the respective governments are trying to clean these terrorists out. So in the case of Aleppo, the Independent here saying Aleppo could witness one of the worst massacres since World War II, while at the same time the Independent says ISIS does not have the guts to continue to fight the fight for Mosul, claims Iraqi Prime Minister. So Aleppo bad, Mosul good. We've got civilians in the same situation in both places. The hypocrisy here is tangible. Let's look at the BBC. Aleppo battle UN alarm as 16,000 civilians flee government advance. Mosul, Iraq battle, IS accused of shooting civilians. The same types of things are going on in both places, where people are trying to leave eastern Aleppo. They're being stopped by the terrorists that are there, who are shooting them in the back as they try to leave. But we've got to criticize Syria, but we don't criticize anything that's going on in Iraq. And if we just go a bit broader, then tens of thousands, this Middle East Eye, tens of thousands flee Syrian armies, East Aleppo advance. And at the same time, we're saying Iraqi forces assault villages outside Mosul, face IS bombers. So the story about Mosul is very positive, and the story about Aleppo is continues to be extremely negative, Alex. And this... I don't even know how to describe it. It goes beyond just simple hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's breathtaking, and I don't think that the deceit is going to last much longer, because I don't know if you've seen this in Western press, Mike. The latest I'm seeing in Russian press is that the whole of North Aleppo has now been liberated by Syrian Arab army and Russian troops. And well, I don't know if there's ground support, but certainly Russian military support there to the operation. And so the northern half of East Aleppo, which was held by ISIS, seems to have fallen. So the stories are going to come out, and I suspect they're going to come out in Russian press with more clarity and volume than they will in the Western press. So we'll keep a close eye on that. But has that actually cascaded to the West yet, that the battle for Aleppo is already half won?
Well, it has to some degree, and I was speaking to Vanessa Bailey yesterday about this, and she's saying that actually in the remaining stronghold, the parts that the Syrian army haven't yet taken, most of the so-called rebels have left already, so the ones that are left are the real diehards, and so both sides are fleeing. Well, we've been hearing rumors that, in fact, there have been attempts to intervene by the West to remove some of the real diehards from eastern Aleppo. And you say, well, why would they want to kill their own people effectively? The view is that they are particularly the Western governments are particularly worried about the stories that are going to come out of eastern Aleppo once this thing is done and dusted. Because the rhetoric that they've been pushing for the last couple of years is going to fall on its head at that point.
Well, it would do, wouldn't it? Because they would be saying, these were the people who appeared on Western TV screens saying, "Help us against evil Assad, who gassed his own people," and this is what these Western friends did to us. So I can quite imagine they would rather put a quick end to those gentlemen's lives first. It's not the first time the West has done things like that.
No, absolutely. And we can't go past without noting what Boris Johnson said about this. I call on those with influence on the regime, especially Russia and Iran, to use this to end the devastating assault on eastern Aleppo and ensure the UN's humanitarian plan for the city can be implemented. The assault is threatening humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of civilians are reported killed in the past fortnight and thousands displaced by attacks over the weekend. We need an immediate ceasefire in Aleppo and immediate access for impartial humanitarian actors to ensure the protection of vulnerable civilians fleeing the fighting. These are humanitarian imperatives. He doesn't say this about Mosul, and I just want to keep making this point because this is an untenable situation, an untenable position for the British government to take.
It is. They're neighbouring countries, and the whole point of ISIS trying to dismember the Sykes-Picot Agreement is that Syria and, well, certainly eastern Syria, western Iraq, were the same tribal area before Britain and France carved them up, and so there's a very close cultural and social unity between the two cases. So people are able to swap experiences. It's conceivable that people who've been liberated in Mosul will manage to speak to people who've been liberated from Aleppo and compare notes, and they might even find that the same guys with the same facial features and habits were involved in both. So there's going to be no way to cover this up. Incidentally, an anonymous German, or I think it was just quoted as a European diplomat, but it's clearly a German, has been quoted in the last week as saying, "I'm fed up talking to this Johnson. I don't take him seriously anymore. Will you please send someone serious to talk to us?"
Wow, that's some comment. Well, look, you mentioned fake news a few minutes ago, so let's look at the BBC because that's always a good place to go if you want some fake news. And back in October, they reported the Syrian aid convoy attack. And this particular article is headlined Syria aid convoy attack, what we know. And what they said is an attack on a Syrian Arab Red Crescent warehouse and a UN aid convoy was in a rebel-held part of northern Syria on the 19th of September, killed at least 18 civilians, including one aid worker. The United States, which backs the rebels, believes Russian or Syrian government warplanes bombed the convoy, but Russia, a key ally of Bashar al-Assad, has rejected the accusation and said US drone was flying overhead at the time of the attack. And they go through the whole thing. They say they ask what happened and they give some spiel. They ask who's to blame, and they ask, was this a war crime? Well, some people weren't terribly enamored by the BBC's coverage of this, and they wrote to the BBC and asked for comment, and they got a response a day or two ago, and this is Keith Granger. BBC said, "Thank you for getting in touch again about our Q&A article on the Syria aid convoy attack, and please accept my apologies for the delay in my response. Having investigated further, the assurance in my previous response that these pictures and footage had been verified by our journalists is not accurate and was the result of a miscommunication." So they published inaccurate information, and what they're claiming now is that publication took place because of a miscommunication. This is the BBC we're talking about, Alex. This is an incredible statement for them to make.
You know, if you listen to the latest Sunday Wire edition on 21st Century Wire, which is with Patrick Henningsen and Vanessa Beeley, talking, of course, about Syria again, he mentions in that interview from last Sunday how American journalists, I think he means people who previously dealt with him, have rung him up and said, "We can't, or we won't, or we don't want to, or whatever, because you're now on this list that we've covered in recent days as people who don't check their sources." So this is the fake news meme which is going around calls all of us in the alternative media fake news on the basis that we don't check our sources. Well, as you can see any day you tune into UK Column News or 21st Century Wire, our sources are often people on the ground in the situation anyway, whether it's Britain or abroad, and certainly people with first-hand knowledge. You can't say that of the BBC, Mike, going on what you've just quoted. I mean, the number of times the BBC doesn't check its sources is going to be about 3 orders of magnitude greater on any given day, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it doesn't just apply to the BBC, because one of the worst culprits in the UK, at least on television news, is Channel 4 News. Channel 4 News used to have a certain level of credibility. That has completely gone out the window in recent months. And sadly, one of the biggest culprits is your namesake, Alex Thomson,
Yes.
at Channel 4 News, and also Parrick Harrington. And Vanessa's had some fantastic conversations recently with them. really asking them to justify the statements they've been making and asking them what their source of information was, and they can't answer. But just getting back to the BBC response once again, they go on and say when the white helmets arrived at the scene of the attack to help the injured, which they normally film doing, they were targeted by jet attacks. Well, none of the films that were that were taken by the white helmets demonstrated that at all. And the BBC says this prevented them from taking pictures or videos of the dead and injured as they normally do in such cases. So what they're basically saying is that because the white helmets, they say, weren't able to take photographs of the dead and injured, that justified, or at least this is the excuse they're giving for why the BBC published unverified images of dead and injured people, which in fact were not from the place at all. And then they go on to say most filming happened after things calmed down. And so the line as it stood in our piece was incorrect. So again, they're not talking about truth. They're not talking about facts even. They're talking about a line. And for a journalistic source such as the BBC to talk about giving a line, it's an acknowledgement that they are simply spinning, and that's being kind to them.
Well, we've got two comments in the chat room which have hit the nail on the head. One is Adrian saying, if the jet attack story were true, why on earth didn't the white helmets film it? Because they seem to have their cameras ready at every other moment. And the other is George saying, if you're annoyed about this BBC lies, which is what it is, bearing in mind that the presenters these days are totally clueless and a lot goes out live and it all ends up on YouTube, the thing to do is to hang around on the phone-in, even if it's very annoying to you, and even if you don't say anything controversial to the researcher who says what you're calling about, so that when you get your moment on live with the anchor, you can say, what on earth are you talking about? And you'll get a couple of truth bombs, as they call them now. You'll get them out before you're cut off. And it gets the new generation of presenters completely flustered. I would mention also on Channel 4 News, Cathy Newman, whom Vanessa has quite rightly torn a strip off recently. But the thing is, Cathy Newman gets away with it because she presents herself as a third-wave feminist. And in that circles, or like Catty Kay, the BBC world correspondent in Washington, all they need to do is write an article on their own website afterwards saying, I felt offended. And that apparently trumps everything. I think that the overreach that we're getting now is that they're trying the same post-truth agenda with other parts of cultural Marxism, so not with the radical feminist agenda, but with issues where truth actually matters, like military facts, for example, geographical facts.
Indeed. So let's just put the BBC article back up and label it as it is, fake news. And we could probably find half a dozen others to put the same label on. Now, Vanessa is about to head off to Syria once again, and she would like to ask for a little bit of financial support for that, if anybody can. If you would like to offer a little support, please go to her website, which is thewallwillfall.org, and you'll find a donate button on there. So that would be a particularly worthwhile thing to do. Okay, Alex, we're starting to run out of time here, so let's just be a bit brief on the next couple if we could. The Ukrainian president has set up a shrine to himself.
There he is, dressed as a Roman patrician, President Poroshenko. And this has been posted by someone on Facebook of his own side, a Maidan activist. And there is Petro Poroshenko in his toga, I don't know, begetting the nation of Ukraine in his image, giving peace from on high to the nation. It's, the crudest of pseudo-Roman imagery with a bit of Catholicism and a bit of sort of Vatican overreach all mixed in. So this is the kind of people that we have on so-called our side, the pro-EU, anti-Russian side on Ukraine. This is a president, and this is in a shrine to himself.
I mean, this is a level of narcissism that Barack Obama would be embarrassed about, even.
It's really left the Ukrainians lost for words. I mean, they've started saying things like, well, he certainly doesn't suffer from a modesty problem. Oh. But I think that in the end, this is going to cause some of the Ukrainians from the far west, who are not his own people, but actually different nationalities, like the Hutsuls, they're actually quite proud people, the Carpathian mountain dwellers, and they're actually going to say, well, we're being taken for a ride here. We didn't, rebel against Russia just to see this guy turn up with his sort of Caesar-like ambitions. So I think it'll backfire on him.
Yes. Okay. Just one more item here that I want to cover and get some comment from you about. Now, the North Dakota protests, this was covered by Ian Crane on Monday night on Humanity versus Insanity. some video clips of the type of things that are going on there. And uh, I think probably the key aspect of this is the fact that the police have become so militarized, and the type of attacks. That's on one hand, but here we've got the independent reporting that the police are now starting to block supplies reaching the protesters, so they're not letting water in, they're not letting food in. Alex, this is a siege, and again, the hypocrisy here is spectacular because if we look at what the Telegraph, and I've just picked the Telegraph, but it could have been any mainstream news outlet over the last 2 or 3 years talking about sieges imposed, they say, by the Assad regime and how food is not allowed into towns and villages in Syria. And yet, US officials doing exactly the same thing. How do, how do they have the barefaced cheek to kind of cover this in the way that they do?
Well, I suppose by tricks of wording, really, because you don't call it a siege, or you don't think of it as being a siege if it's the same nationality on both sides of the fence. You call it something else, like a containment operation. I mean, these photographs coming from the water protectors coverage in North Dakota are really quite frightening and stunning. And these guys are all robo-copped up. And obviously, if they're dousing these protesters at night while they're hemming them in on bridges, if they're dousing them with cold water while it's already sub-zero, and if they're denying them food, these people are obviously going to starve and freeze to death. That's something I never thought we'd see in the United States.
Yes, absolutely. So just to sort of finish this one off, I want to bring this back up because we covered this a couple of weeks ago. The fact that NATO troops are being allocated so-called non-lethal weapons. And many of these weapons very similar to the one that this gent is holding in his arms here, were being used by the US police. Were they all US police? They may have been federal police. We don't really know. But anyway, the question that came up at the time, if you remember, was somebody asking, but if troops are to be given non-lethal weapons, does this not mean that they're no longer soldiers, that they're policemen doing law and order? And this was a good question. Now, I highlighted the equipment that they were being given, these so-called less lethal weapons. And these are the rounds that they fire, which are a kind of baton round. And they range from impact only to impact plus an irritating effect. So the material that's inside them actually irritates the skin. And a whole range of different paint colors in between. So you can tag people with different paint colors if you want to identify them later. And some of these types of ballistics were being used with the water protectors, and you could see some of them with the colored paint blobs on them. And even in the documentation, it is pointed out that these weapons can cause fatal injury. But the key point I wanted to highlight and remind everybody again was the European Defence Agency meeting between NATO and the EU last November, on the 17th of November 2015. And this is the happy couple. They're always kissing each other every time they meet. And I don't know what's going on there, but this is Jens Stoltenberg and Federica Mogherini. And, as I've said before, I want to remind everybody this, at that European Defence Agency conference, the message from Federica Mogherini was that we need to merge military and policing functions. This was a very key part of what they were saying at that conference. And we're basically saying exactly that, at least in the way that so-called civilian police are being deployed in certain parts of the world. We're seeing this type of thinking appearing on the front line, as it were, Alex. And this has got to worry people.
Well, in a nutshell, it's the same as what we were talking about earlier with intelligence functions with regard to Britain and Germany there in the middle of the broadcast. Military corresponds to foreign intelligence. It is, using all our resources, throwing everything we've got against overseas threats because they're not our people and we don't have loyalty to them other than common human decency and the knowledge that we'll be judged for what we do. Domestic societies arrange themselves far better, with far more protections and have civil liberties, is the turn of phrase. And that's why we have police rather than military, and why we have distinct domestic intelligence agencies with far fewer powers and who are supposed to have a much lower caseload at any time. It's because we don't treat our own people in the same way we treat other people. The only reason you'd want to merge everything is if you want to go all out for a totalitarian one world government.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, look, you wanted to mention this, so I'm just going to end off with this one. Nicola Sturgeon, this is a tweet to Nicola Sturgeon. I like the idea of a Celtic corridor, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Ireland. And your
Yeah.
response, yes, Scott Gov, sorry, loves pulling strings in Northern Ireland and the Republic, and you're highlighting the Doherty files here. So just very briefly on this one.
Yeah. Well, Michael Gray is he works for Common Space. The Scottish nationalist movement has decided that Facebook and Twitter are too fair and balanced for them, and they've got a new social media platform called Common Space where they only allow Scott Nats to speak, and they have a newspaper in the same mould called The National, which Guido Fawkes this week described as bonkers fake newspaper, The National. And Michael Gray writes for both of these outfits, and he's actually quoting Sturgeon from her appearance this week in Dublin, where she hurrahed the setting up of the Scottish hub within the British Embassy in Dublin. You see, and of course the Scottish hub is, or it was described by the half-witted Irish social workers in the Doherty case as the Scottish Embassy. But anyway, the Scottish hub within the British Embassy is appropriating to itself all consular authority over Scots in Ireland, it seems, under cover of being there for Scottish business or whatever. So he was in the audience and he was quoting her in Dublin. But he won't be aware, I don't think, of all the stuff that the Scottish Freemasonry-based establishment has done on both sides of the border in Ireland in the Doherty case. So it's up to us to make them aware.
Okay, well, I think we're going to end there. Alex, thank you very much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank all our viewers for joining us today as well. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow, 1 p.m. Well, hopefully Brian will be back with us in due course. See you then. Bye-bye.